Thank you very much for the opportunity to INHWE again to present. It's great, actually. The last time I was at a conference was in Athens, so it's great to be back amongst colleagues and you know, have the opportunity to really share practice, which has been a great couple of days. So thank you very much. And thank you also, I have to thank Cardiff University because what I'm presenting today is part of my doctoral studies. So they've supported me in that, and also my supervisors from Cardiff University. I've got some details on the first slide there if anybody wants to get in contact following this. So as I said, this is part of my doctoral study and really came from my interest in leadership. So I'm a senior lecturer at Cardiff University and I teach on the undergraduate programme for nursing, adult nursing, but also postgraduate across health professions. But my sort of area of interest really is leadership, quality improvement and change. So that's really where the topic for my doctorate came from. And specifically for this, I was looking at undergraduate nurse education. And so that's where my research question developed from. And the title of my presentation is really a quote from Keats, which because I think my early education was in English literature, so I brought a lot of literature into my doctorate studies. But it's interesting that this quote really pins down what I think about leadership in terms of having experienced it as well as having the theory to support development. So really my research question was, what are students, educators, senior nurses' experience of leadership? And what are their perceptions in terms of the leadership preparation in that undergraduate education? So a bit about the background really to the topic. Certainly in the UK, leadership development is a core requirement now within undergraduate education and educational standards. And the Nursing and Midwifery Council have it set within those requirements. So nurses are required to demonstrate leadership principles at point of registration. So they need to understand what leadership is and demonstrate those leadership principles clearly. There's also an international focus on the importance of quality in preparing nurses, and also in the role of nurses in leadership in a wider context really. So what I've noticed very much was lots of different approaches to curriculum design, pedagogical approaches to leadership development. There's some examples there. Service learning experiences, active learning approaches, self-assessment, 360-degree assessments. And these are really not unique to nurse education, they're across professions, but there seem to be lots of different approaches available. So there's no real consistent approach or indeed clear definition within nurse education, certainly, of what leadership means, what it is and what it means for nursing, and the expectations of that as nurses come into registration. And often you find leadership emerging in the final year of nurse education. So it's that kind of tag-on topic really, without seamlessly going throughout the programme. So in terms of undergraduate students, often in conversations with my own students sort of find it difficult to see themselves as leaders, find it challenging in terms of what leadership means, when really they just want to deliver safe, effective care for their patients. And students in the UK study 50% in practice, 50% in university. So there are challenges in terms of that practice theory gap. And this has been attributed to high attrition rates and non-registration actually on completion of their programmes. So exploring nurses' perceptions of their awareness would provide further insight into that whole experience. And also I thought it was important to include educators and the nurses who support the students in practice, because they're also involved, obviously, in the preparation and education of nurses. So my study aims really were to acquire an understanding of those perceptions, of the experiences of those three groups, to understand the expectations of leadership skills in terms of entering registration, and also their views on that preparation. So throughout those years, in terms of education in university and also within practice. What I noticed while doing my literature search really was there's such a variety of terminology used both within the empirical research and in educational theories and curricular design. So there's some examples there. Clinical leadership is used, non-technical skills, and leadership and management are very much used interchangeably. So there's no clear definitions around those two things. There seemed to be a paucity in empirical research, evaluating the effectiveness of different approaches, and a lack of definition and clarity in this context. And there was contrasting evidence really as to the importance that students placed on leadership as a concept, but also as a skill. So my methodology, I'm thinking now back to the story aid session, which was really interesting. So my interest is in about individual stories and how narratives bring rich experiences to research. And I also used photographic elicitation, which came out of a personal interest really in my teaching. I use images and pictures to associate with leadership, to bring out metaphors and associations. I use semi-structured interviews, third-year students. So in narrative inquiry, you don't need large groups. So I had 5 third-year students, 6 academics, and 1 senior nurse. And I used Clandon and Connolly's framework, mainly because they associate experience with narratives and how educational experience can be studied narratively. And the thematic analysis I used was Dewey's experiential continuum. So Dewey is very much involved in experiential learning, and that's sort of my background. I'm really interested in that, along with the philosophical approach of Nussbaum and capabilities approach to social justice. So metaphorically, narrative inquiry brings meaning to enlighten more holistic view really of experiences, and a 3-dimensional approach from Dewey, which looks at temporality, sociality and place. So those 3 areas really were the basis for looking at the experiential learning within that analysis. So experience in terms of the temporality, Dewey sees the experience as being formed from previous experience, current and in the future. Sociality refers to the context of the experience, so the social areas, the cultural background, things such as professions and political views. And place, of course, the physical experience. So particularly I was interested in students learning in both contexts, so in clinical areas and in university. And as I mentioned, I used images, so photographic images, and I also looked at critical events, which comes from Webster and Mortova, where an event can be viewed as critical when it is emotionally disturbing, positive or negative, but can really influence the person and influence their perception of self in the future. So that very much fitted into how I saw leadership really in this area. So a bit more about the photographic elicitation. I used my own images. I just took pictures of landscapes, nature, and used those at the end of my interviews to try and take the exploration really of individuals' thoughts and stories a step further. So certainly images are being used more and more in leadership development philosophies and also in narrative inquiry. And there's some examples there of some of the quotes anonymised from individuals in the study to see how they link the images there, such as the tree with the roots, leading up as the team towards the tree, and also acknowledging there the messiness or the complexity of working within teams. And I also like this one from the image of the rock, where, you know, certainly this person saw the sea and the rock as the challenges and the sort of conflicts within teams and leadership. So there were some really nice associations coming out from those. So some of the findings, I've really summarised these, but some of the important findings were that the participants' experience of leadership shared each story really around their perceptions of their experiences. The student narratives revealed some tensions between their expectations of leadership themselves as leaders, defining leadership and associating experiences with self in future, so their vision of themselves in the future. Some negative examples of leadership, autocratic leadership, etc., were explored, and this emerged throughout all the participants really, so for students, academics and senior nurse. So this was very much a feature within some experiences, and they explored sort of the cultures within organisational cultures and places of work. So connecting theory to practice within different learning contexts highlighted this theory-practice gap, which seems to continue to be challenging for some students. So marrying up what they learn within university and then sort of tying that into their experiences within the clinical areas. Becoming self-aware was really important, seen as important in terms of leadership development by the academics and the nurse, less so by students some hadn't made that link, but all supported an ongoing process for opportunities for leadership development and self-awareness, and that time to reflect, to link theory to practice and reflect and think about what that means for them. And all participants certainly saw leadership as important for nursing and across healthcare. So both within nursing profession and across healthcare professions, important particularly in the quality and safety of patient care and the drive for quality improvement. So I put a few more images just as examples, because there's some really nice nice words here, that were interwoven in their stories at the end to link back into their experiences. So for example, with the woods there, that was certainly seen as a top-down approach, using knowledge and power, knowledge as power. The roots being a support, but also nurturing growth within teams. Interestingly, the image from the plane there, the image of the sunset, even though that bridge is very much in the distance, that was seen as linking up, and so an important part of leadership. So some interesting things there, and certainly the one at the centre that was associated with things I had expected it to be, so being bossy and not perhaps leading the team that well. So within the analysis, two overarching themes emerged really. There was awakening, where the participants were becoming aware of expectations of them as nurses, and that was as students and also as academics. Lots of reflection on how perhaps they hadn't thought of themselves as leaders and then had to take on roles that required leadership. Also linking into values, self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and nursing practice. And then the second theme really was around social and cultural context of learning, so that the difference between learning in clinical practice and in university, but also the hierarchy of the professions across healthcare, and the hierarchy and levels of leadership really that were experienced within an organisation such as the NHS. And also really importantly there, the influence of role models in leadership development, that was seen as really important. So some brief recommendations from this, really clarity and consistency in terminology I think came across as being really important for undergraduate nurses. and also for the regulator, perhaps in terms of the expectations for nurses as they enter registration. Opportunities for experience and alignment of role models to theory could be seen as a great opportunity to really help them link that up. Promotion of positive and inclusive leadership role models, and the ability to perhaps not challenge while they're in the situation, but having time and space to challenge and discuss negative examples of leadership was seen as important. Students encouraged, I think, to see themselves as in their role, as influencers for the future. So seeing their ability to influence and lead nursing, not just individually, but wider, and influence policy, having a seat at the wider table, really. And opportunities to explore leadership development through active learning pedagogies, problem solving, linking leadership to professional values within the nursing curricula, and I think embedding early within the programme so that it's not an element that comes at the end of the curricula, at the end of the programme, rather that it's embedded right from the beginning so that students understand the value and importance of leadership within nursing, but also for their future role. So in terms of a contribution to knowledge, I think using the narrative inquiry approach and the photographic elicitation, I haven't seen anything else like that before, so I think that was quite a different approach. And also embedding the philosophy of Nussbaum was really enlightening, looking at emotions as cognitive responses and valuing experience really in development and learning. And the vagueness and definition of leadership, I think, evokes a disparate approach perhaps to leadership development within the curriculum, so that's perhaps something to consider as well. The limitations of the study, well, this was in the field of nursing, narrative inquiries at different stages. I was very aware of the timing, so I finished my interviews, I think it was at the end of March last year, so it was just when COVID was coming, and certainly the impact on students has been great. And of course, this study was limited to nurse education, but I'm very aware there are possibilities for extending this across professions. So I guess what's next is further research really and development in this area. So I think that's it in terms of my presentation. There's some references at the end, but I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Nice to see all of you guys. My name is Avery Olson. As mentioned, I'm a fourth-year medical student at Sanford School of Medicine in the University of South Dakota in the landlocked center of the United States. This presentation is titled Do No Harm, International Strategies to Avoid Harmful Medical Voluntourism. I have no disclosures, and while my views do not necessarily represent the views of the Sanford School of Medicine, they certainly are views that have probably been agreed upon by a lot of my colleagues. While I have tried to make the following information as applicable to every region of the world as possible, there may be bias, especially as the objectives in the following slides were created in reference to an elective in Guatemala, specifically a Highland Indigenous community. I have prior experience in Mozambique as well, and while I find the following objectives very applicable to my prior work there, understand that this information is probably more applicable to rural, medically underserved communities. However, these are often the recipient communities of medical outreach. I'll start with some of the positives of global health immersion, followed by a few of the negatives. From there, we will discuss voluntourism, a definition within the context of medicine, and then finally, we will outline 4 strategies to mitigate the risk of medical voluntourism. So some of the positives of global health immersion. As we know, it provides the service. So we are providing healthcare assistance through knowledge, resource exchange, by actually being present in certain communities that may not have had these services before, and also by financial assistance through tourism dollars for the areas that are served, sometimes financial assistance to local nonprofits, through just being present in the community in general, and then opportunities to learn from the diverse communities. Just to name a few. So negatives, some will argue that it boosts a Western governmental agenda, that there's less regulation and oversight, both from the home country standpoint as well as the recipient country. It causes existing health infrastructure to collapse. There may be lack of university accreditation specific to global electives that often have diverse and differing needs than specific university electives within the university itself. So voluntourism, I've gotten a lot of questions about this word recently because it's not necessarily one that is in the dictionary, but it is a form of tourism where travelers volunteer their time to help others, typically for charity. So that definition does not necessarily just mean medical voluntourism, but medical voluntourism is, of course, what we'll focus on here. So medical voluntourism is a medical trip where a program usually is of a couple weeks duration. It may be organized by medical schools, religious groups, or others, and provide a variety of services. There may be one specialty, such as orthopedics or ophthalmology, or maybe even general family practice. The medical service costs are often or mostly free due to poverty in the selected communities. These trips aim to provide a medical service to the underserved, often with an educational component for both the visiting party and the local community. And there's a difference between voluntourism and volunteerism. In voluntourism, you are going with the purpose of having a new experience and volunteering, and you're still hoping to glean those skills and some of the experiences with the community, and it doesn't have to be malicious to still be voluntourism. But with volunteerism, you essentially wouldn't be leaving your community within this definition. So the educational component with volunteerism and voluntourism still can include cultural, medical, and religious subjects. And as we mentioned before, it can be harmful. And this is just a list again of some of the same negatives that we have listed on the prior slide. We may reinforce paternalism. People may create unsustainable projects where that project, as soon as you leave, is completely broken down, or maybe you brought equipment and you didn't provide any information with how to fix that equipment, or there's no one with those skills available within that community or country that is receiving your services. And then volunteer efforts may not be concentrated into the most needed sectors. One of the examples that I give there is if you're going in and you're doing cervical cancer screening and you're doing all your pap smears, but the community doesn't have access to food and people are hungry, then perhaps it's not the most needed sector and you need to reevaluate some of your projects. So next we'll get into a few of those key skills that might help you develop a project and how we can mitigate those risks. There's 4 different points that I have kind of put together, but have quite a bit of background from other sources that I'll list shortly. So requiring pre-departure training, addressing the needs of the host community, a two-way learning exchange focus, and self-reflection and debriefing are 4 different objectives. So the first one here, requiring pre-departure training, is based off of one that I actually read from Medicine, which is a UK-based group at the time for medical study abroad, including 5 key steps for ethical electives. The first of those key steps is a pre-departure training, including personal safety, cultural awareness, and language competency topics. This list of pre-departure topics is not yet comprehensive, however. One study from Lehigh University identified 611 US-based nonprofits that provide medical care abroad, and after extensive surveying of both the nonprofits and their host communities, they established that the host community staff had extensive knowledge on what pre-departure training should include. However, the nonprofit organizers were not including cultural basic language recommendations from the host community staff in their volunteer training sessions. Pre-departure training should not only include issues of personal safety, cultural awareness, and language. It should be designed with the local community staff in order to address education gaps in volunteers. Creating the training should be a fluid process, so knowledge gaps identified within each group of new volunteers can be filled before arrival in the host community. The second is addressing the needs of the host community. The medical needs of the community need to be identified by the community itself. So in the example given earlier, the community itself probably didn't identify the risk for cervical cancer. However, they certainly would identify the need for more food or other food options. Once the needs are identified, it's important to consider whether they would be addressed by supporting existing local services, assuring there is no competition. One case brought up by Source Co et al. Explains how a surgical team set out to repair cleft lips was faced with the realization that their intervention was not prioritized for the local community. They, in that community, did not fix their cleft lips for a very long time. For them, it wasn't something that was seen as an issue or a concern, and they believed that they had lots of other things that they would rather have done for their community. In that example, they still use the cleft lip repairs as an opportunity to train local healthcare workers, but state that ideally would have figured out the goals and values of the local medical team before visiting the country. When the needs are predetermined before entering the country, it allows for goal development and more direct planning with the host community if you can have that communication prior to a global health immersion elective. Two-way learning exchange focus is one that I think a lot of different people focus on when they go on certain trips. And there's no doubt that medical students should have a two-way learning exchange between themselves and the community they are serving. This helps assure the community is not being exploited or patronized and builds trust, leading to a more fruitful medical intervention. In addition, many students report feeling like they face ethical and medical dilemmas they are not prepared for during their global health education. If the student is engaged with the community, mutual understanding gained from learning exchange may help relieve some of that stress. And you'll see in all caps there, one of the words that I highlighted is humility. The last is self-reflection and debriefing. Self-reflection allows one to recognize their own biases and how they are playing a part in their global health experience. As bias can be found throughout the entire process, time should be set aside for self-reflection before departure, during the elective, and after return. Self-exploration can be initiated through the 6 I's of identity, ignorance, intention, ideology, imagination, and investment. Promoting reflection before the trip may help set expectations and alleviate some fear of the unknowns. Reflecting after the trip may identify room for improvement, as well as address any feelings of unfulfillment. It also allows one to reflect on the diversity of disparities and differences in health literacy in a global context. Areas of improvement should not only be identified through reflection, but also through predefined outcome measures created in collaboration with the students and the communities before departure. So both the students and communities will have input on what they would like to glean from the experience, and then we can have some data on how those predetermined ideas are being met. So in conclusion, when designing global medical electives and accrediting them within your university, it is important to be aware of the unique ethical challenges that may accompany them. The 4 strategies listed in the prior slides will help you design an elective that is specific to the region you will be providing healthcare. It allows for appreciation of the specific ethical challenges of the host community and incorporation of those ethical concerns into learning objectives. While this list may not seem comprehensive, I think that with full consideration of each of these objectives or strategies, they can become more comprehensive. For example, with a 2-way learning exchange, that may include training individuals in the host community to learn certain technology like ultrasound and how to troubleshoot it if there are concerns, beyond just thinking about what our learners are gleaning from the experience, as well as what the host community, host health workers, whatever else are gleaning. In our globalized society, this objective can rely heavily on utilization of electronic communication and telemedicine. And of course, some of those skills are highly encouraged to be incorporated. It is important to remember each community is different. And while these objectives were made with consideration of an elective in Guatemala, they are applicable around the world as they allow for consideration of each community and culture. I would even argue that a lot of these objectives would be applicable to some of our home communities here in the United States, such as our Native nations and cultures that are home to the state that myself and my colleagues are a part of here in South Dakota at fairly high numbers. I, of course, could talk about experiences specific to Guatemala and Mozambique for absolute hours, but this presentation would certainly not allow for it, and I'm happy to answer any questions going forward. And please feel free to contact me with any concerns or questions, or simply to have a discussion. I would be so open to that. I'm very passionate about this topic.
Thank you. So one may ask, why post-traumatic growth? A little about my background. I worked in East Africa, in the slums of Nairobi, and also in the Lamu region on the southeast of Kenya, where there used to be a lot of attacks by some Somali people. It is on the border between Somalia and Kenya, by people used to be nicknamed or dubbed as the Shifta. And going through these on a number of occasions across a number of years, I have realized that trauma is not always tragic and is not always the end of it all. And this inspired a lot of interest within me in mental health. And eventually I focused my research on childhood maltreatment here in Malta when I returned back, but also about stress and burnout among healthcare professionals, and also how various traumas, including cancer, but not just cancer, can bring growth to certain people. And what are those factors that may in reality help some people to grow, to progress in life, while to other people, apparently this process, this dynamic, for some reason that may be more complicated than we might like to think it is, does not bring any growth, any post-traumatic growth. So this is where I'm coming from with regards to this research. So people are resilient and much more than we normally think they are. However, everyone has his or her breaking point. We can see it, isn't it? During this present COVID-19 pandemic. It's so important to realize your breaking point, the red flags that there are, that our system, our body shows us about. So a growing number of studies are showing that people report psychological growth after experiencing different types of trauma, dubbed the post-traumatic growth theory by these researchers, Tedeschi and Calhoun. And they make a difference between post-traumatic growth, or in short, PTG, and resilience, whereby they are emphasizing that in post-traumatic growth, we are seeing the ability of humans to bounce back to, if not where they were before, to a certain level of average, of balance. And that is crucial in this theory. Now, a number of researchers are showing that what goes on within this dynamic that we are nicknaming as post-traumatic growth is what challenges to the core beliefs, which then predict this growth process. So whenever we go through an experience, we call it a trauma. It can be cancer, it can be near-death experience, it can be anything that challenges our core beliefs. That seems to instill in us this process that eventually, of course, it doesn't occur by the click of a moment. It takes time. It may take even a lifetime. But it will start this process within us of a certain growth. And this growth can be in more ways than one, as we shall see. Also, according to Taku, deliberate cognitive processing appears to play a key role in this dynamic that we call post-traumatic growth. Now, what are the key potential benefits of PTG? Number one, feeling stronger and finding hidden strengths. So it's like going back and review my available strengths that perhaps have been latent up to now. Of course, after this experience that I have experienced, the trauma or whatever it has been. Number two, the strengthening of good relationships, especially to the significant others, not just one person, but a number of people, the bonds, the affiliations I have. And number three is the alteration of priorities. So I'm doing a new priority list of priorities and philosophies concerning present day and other people significant in life. Particularly this focus on the here and now. Very often we are stuck. We are either stuck in the past or we are stuck in the future. In the past on remunerations and guilt feelings, etc., about things that may have been done better, or in the future about worries, about expectations, etc. But apparently in this post-traumatic growth process, there is a refocusing. People who love pictures, photography, know that very often they need to fine-tune their picture, their zooming, etc. And apparently this is one similar approach that apparently happens, seemingly happens in this post-traumatic growth process, that you refocus your life and where you are going to. Now, Helgeson in 2006 proposed three key hypotheses. First one, post-traumatic growth leads to positive life changes, which improve well-being. Secondly, post-traumatic growth leads to life changes, but at the same time, it comes at a price. It lowers well-being because it is a stressful journey. Of course, the stress inherent in the journey can never be erased. Okay, it is part and parcel of the journey. And thirdly, finally, post-traumatic growth is a coping strategy that mediates trauma with well-being. So the intriguing questions, which I already tried to mention before, is why do some people benefit? It seems a number of people, a good number of people, benefit from post-traumatic growth, while others don't, in view of the same events. Personality and mood states consistently link to this growth. So here, the key variables, we are looking at personality, we are looking also at spirituality, and later on we shall explain why. Now, the value is seen from three perspectives. Number one is a coping mechanism, and which is very similar to a mechanism that goes on in post-traumatic growth. Two, as a social support, and we all know, in English we say, no man is an island, so important, particularly during a time of crisis like the one we are going through right now globally, the COVID time. So social support. Thirdly, the third perspective for spirituality, it's as providing a meaningfulness in life. And we all know, and psychology has been inundated with this aspect, that having a meaningful element in life is key to hope. And we all know how so relevant hope is. Of course, then there is well-being. And well-being, we are looking at it as a subjective well-being, but also as a positive and negative effect. In the study, we looked at tertiary students here in Malta with a mean age of 21, mostly Maltese and mostly Roman Catholic, 81%. And the materials that we looked were the post-traumatic growth inventory, the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist, the personality tool, a perceived stress tool, and two well-being scales, the PANAS, which is positive and negative affect, and the subjective well-being scale, which is the subjective well-being inventory, and then a spirituality scale, the FMS, faith maturity scale. So what can we say about the findings in short? Post-traumatic growth positively correlated with a personality profile high on conscientiousness and agreeableness. Now, just to make a little prior introduction to personality, in psychological research, we love to look, not just we love to look, personality is being seen currently and for a long time, particularly after the great work by Costa and McRae, two American psychologists, that personality is being seen from 5 domains. We have neuroticism or negative affect, which basically look, gauge one's person stability, emotional stability, level of anxiety, depression, psychosis, etc. Okay, and then you have conscientiousness, which means how a person is deliberate, considerate, self-control, sensitive, etc. Then you have agreeableness, how a person is trustful, open, pro-social, pro-others, etc. And then you have openness to experience, how much a person is creative, and extraversion. And extraversion has to do with how much a person is a people person vis-a-vis, for example, a gadget person, for example. So in our study, post-traumatic growth correlated significantly and positively with a personality profile high on these 2 domains, conscientiousness and agreeableness. Now, conscientiousness, we are seeing a person who is thorough, deliberate, meticulous, disciplined, but on the other hand, there is also an element of compassion, of pro-social attitude, of a trust, of a open to others. So we hypothesized that spirituality and post-traumatic growth would have unique variance in predicting well-being. Now, to determine this possibility, a series of hierarchical regressions were performed for all predictor variables with all components of well-being, entered separately as the criterion or outcome variable. Now, the goal of multiple regression, we should remember, is to find the contributions of all relevant variables and not simply the strongest ones. So the aim is to provide most comprehensive explanatory model possible according to what we have in our view. And these are the three hierarchical regressions. We have positive affect as the first outcome variable, negative affect as the second, and cognitive well-being as the third. And we notice that in hierarchical regression, we look at the R-square and the adjusted R-square, and the adjusted R-square is the most important here. And we are seeing that there is significance on all adjusted R-square, and we are seeing that there is a range from 0.18 to 0.33. We shall explain that later on. These are the beta weights for the three outcome subjective well-being variables. So basically, what does this mean? The value of post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth explained 18 to 33% of the variance of well-being, even after controlling for perceived stress, personality, and faith maturity. Please bear with me, I'm going back 2 slides. So here we see post-traumatic growth. It is entered in the 4th step each time in each hierarchical regression. And prior to it, there is perceived stress scale, there's personality, there is spirituality. And in each analysis, okay, post-traumatic growth did contribute, did have a unique variance, meaning that even after one controls for perceived stress, for personality, and for spirituality, we all know that these two normally contribute for change in people's lives after trauma. Post-traumatic growth still had a 0.28 of unique variance vis-a-vis when positive affect was the outcome variable. It had 0.18 to negative affect as a unique variance, and mostly 0.33 as a unique variance to cognitive well-being. So it is important that post-traumatic growth relates to all facets of subjective well-being. What about, excuse me, what about the value of spirituality? So far from being a human quality that speaks only to the dark side of human nature and existence, the real value of spirituality from a functional psychological standpoint may well be its ability to enhance human flourishing. So basically what we are saying is having more spirituality does not mean that I may not still, having more spirituality doesn't mean that I am immune from pain, from the possibility of a cancer or the possibility of COVID-19, of course not. But the difference is this, that having more spirituality can help me put in perspective my reality, okay, my reality of pain, of trauma, of whatever, okay, into perspective. And thereby, I will be more motivated to face my reality rather than find any ways to deny. We know that denial is a huge, Freud used to speak a lot about denial, about defense mechanisms. It is a huge defense mechanism. And of course, it will stop us, keep us from growing further, and also from doing any delay mechanisms or derailed mechanisms, like using drugs, for example. A lot of people use drugs to escape from pain, for example. So how exactly spirituality works as a buffer is not clearly established from this model. But what is at stake is that spirituality does have a value. So results, however, point at religious belief rather than behavior as beneficial in providing this cognitive framework. What I'm saying is putting the reality in perspective. that might counter hopelessness. And we all know that hopelessness is a key, perhaps the greatest key ingredient in depression, in clinical depression. So spirituality may ease the negative impact of trauma by increasing affective well-being among victims of trauma. As Baumeister said, suffering stimulates the need for meaning because people analyze and question their sufferings far more than their joys. Of course, suffering reminds us of our finiteness. So this study, we need to say, is basically correlational in study. In nature, no inference of causality can be made. Post-traumatic growth increasingly is gaining attention even among cross-cultural populations, including this study among Maltese tertiary students. Another strength is the multidimensional focus in bundling together a number of measures singly identified as important in related research by Costa and McRae. And the study confirms the incremental validity of faith and of post-traumatic as predictors of the three well-being scales. In conclusion, although situational factors and personality did play important roles, the study clearly has indicated that spirituality and post-traumatic growth were also found to be important additional components of well-being. So these two may counter hopelessness and form an important part of this equation. These are my references, and thank you very much for your attention.
My name is Gavin. I'm a third-year medical student at the University of South Dakota, Sanford School of Medicine. And as he said, today I'll be presenting on training standardized patients to provide effective feedback. This is a course that myself, along with my faculty advisors, Julie Swenson and Dr. Valerie Kuzmenko, developed. And really the point of this course was twofold. First, we want to make standardized patient performance better and more consistent. And second, we believe improving the standardized patient's feedback will in turn enhance medical students' communication and physical exam skills. So for those of you that aren't really familiar with standardized patients or haven't seen one in a while, they're actors that memorize the script and portray specific symptoms during an encounter with medical students to help train and evaluate students in a clinical setting. And after these encounters, standardized patients are expected to give feedback to the students. This immediate feedback is based on the principle of deliberate practice, which ultimately helps students to modify performance and develop interpersonal skills. However, providing feedback isn't always easy. Difficulty in feedback may be based on reluctance to give offense or provoke undue defensiveness in students, and also time to provide feedback is minimal between encounters. And so, therefore, the feedback must be efficient. The most valuable learning occurs when students receive detailed feedback delivered in a way they can utilize it. And so our training course really focused on providing both positive and corrective feedback. So our course consisted of a media-enhanced presentation on types of feedback and an introduction of a structured feedback model, as you can see to the right of the screen there. And each standardized patient had the opportunity to practice both giving and receiving feedback during the training session following this model. So we'll kind of run through the model real quick so you guys have an understanding of it. First, the standardized patient would solicit the student's input, asking how they thought their interpersonal skills were during the encounter. After allowing self-reflection from the student, they would give constructive feedback based on a specific behavior the student exhibited and then tie it to how it made them feel. They would then give a recommendation for next time on how to improve in that specific situation. So after that, they would then it would then be followed by a positive comment for a positive comment on a specific behavior, again tied to a feeling, and then lastly they would check for understanding from the student. And this was more for oral feedback. It was kind of modified for the written feedback. To recruit our standardized patients, an invitation to participate in our training was sent to all standardized patients within the University of South Dakota database. 51 standardized patients accepted the invitation, were enrolled in one of 10 training sessions from July 2020 to December 2020. And each training session lasted approximately 2 hours. It was conducted by either myself or one of my faculty mentors. So for data collection, we gathered demographics and administered a survey prior to training and then one after training, each evaluating 2 main categories, one being their attitude toward giving feedback. So this had 12 items graded on a 5-point Likert scale. And then the second was their knowledge about types of feedback. And this was evaluated using 8 multiple choice questions. After the standardized patients had the opportunity to use the feedback model in an encounter, they were then evaluated with a performance checklist. This checklist had 10 items that they either met or did not meet during the encounter. So this is our assessment for pre and post training. And so on the left, you can see there. So on the left are the items used to gauge self-confidence and attitude regarding feedback. So they answered questions on their comfort level of different aspects of feedback, such as giving feedback, recognizing areas of improvement, and then knowledge base. And then on the right is the 8-question knowledge assessment, and it doesn't have the multiple choice options listed, but those are the questions. And then these questions really tested knowledge acquired in the training regarding types of feedback and appropriate ways of giving feedback. So this is our an example of our performance checklist. So you can see each survey has the standardized patient's name, date, and then the case that was performed. On the left-hand column, you can see the items that were evaluated, so the 10 different items. On the top row is each student encounter. So each survey encompasses 1 day. So this survey would be one day for a headache case, and the standardized patient saw 5 different students. So the standardized patient would get a 1 in each student column for completion of that item during the encounter and a 0 for not completing the item. And the totals show completion percentages of items for each encounter in the blue, and then in the orange is completion of each item throughout the day. So for analysis, we ran a Cronbach's alpha, which demonstrated internal consistency throughout our data. And for the attitude part of the pre and post training survey, we used the Wilcoxon rank test. And for the knowledge portion, a one-tailed paired t-test was used. And at this point, we're still collecting data on the performance part, so the performance checklist. So we haven't analyzed the performance survey yet, but we do have some observations and some descriptive statistics. So here are the results for the pre and post training survey for the attitude portion. And we found 4 items that showed statistical difference in the attitude portion of the survey. So the 4 items were listed are listed there. So I'm comfortable giving written feedback. The second one, I have a strong knowledge base regarding giving feedback. 3, I can easily identify learners' areas that need improvement. And 4, I am comfortable reading and interpreting learners' nonverbal messages. And then table 1 there just shows the mean difference between each item, and then also the p-value associated with that. So continuing the survey analysis, this shows the 8 multiple choice knowledge portion, which also showed statistical significance between the pre and post training surveys. So the graph on the left shows the raw percentage scores for each participant on both the pre-training survey, which is the blue line, and then the post-training survey, which is the orange line there. And then on the right, we can see the means for both the pre-training and post-training surveys. And then again, it's statistically significant with that p-value there. So this table 3 shows the 10-point performance checklist items. and the average completion of each items for all of the 29 standardized patients that participated in the performance portion of the study. So if you remember, I said there's 51 total standardized patients that received the training. 29 actually had a chance to be evaluated using the performance survey. So this is that data. And the 3 values highlighted in red were completed the least, and all of these corresponded to giving a constructive comment. So analysis of pre and post training surveys suggests the training implemented had the desired effect of making standardized patients more comfortable in giving feedback and improving knowledge. Specifically, standardized patients are more comfortable in giving written feedback, reading and interpreting learners' nonverbal messages, identifying learners' areas for improvement, and having a stronger knowledge base in giving feedback. We believe the other items in the attitude portion of the survey were not statistically significant. Because scores on the pre-training survey were higher, and so it suggested that SPs were already comfortable or overconfident in their abilities. So preliminary performance data also suggests standardized patients are acquiring the skills set forth in the training sessions. Our cohort of the 29 standardized patients have above 90% completion for 6 of the 10 items measured. And the most difficult task to complete seemed to be centered around giving constructive criticism. And we recognize that constructive criticism is just inherently difficult to give and expected completion to be lower in this area. So we also noticed warming up effect with some of the standardized patients within like the first 1 to 2 encounters of the day, and then it quickly corrects. And so what I mean by that is that they're scoring lower at the beginning of the day, but after the first few encounters, their scores increase and then become more consistent. So overall conclusions, 1, training standardized patients in their role to give feedback is beneficial. We found that they're very appreciative and receptive to the training. They gave comments of feeling much more prepared for their encounters and an increase in overall confidence. And then 2, as expected, the constructive feedback and items related to giving constructive feedback were most difficult to accomplish for our standardized patients. So future directions. So we're going to continue data collection and then obviously report the performance statistics. And we're also interested in looking at looking to see if there's a correlation between written and oral feedback. And if one is more prone to like stereotypical or non-constructive statements, like good job or well done, just kind of those statements that really don't have any substance to them. And then lastly, after establishing the standardized patient training program over the next few years, we want to monitor the rate at which medical students learn various skills that depend on the quality of the feedback from the standardized patients. So here are my references. I just want to thank you guys for taking the time to listen to the presentation and welcome any questions at this time.